Hello and welcome to this introduction to the culture of homelessness. My name is Marty Maltby and I'm going to be your guide through this presentation. And because it is a long one, let's jump right into it. I'm going to give you a brief introduction here, and then we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about what culture is and what homelessness is. But then we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about the situation that the homeless, especially the long-term homeless, face, and the response that they use to cope with this situation and the culture that develops out of it. Now, I do want to give a couple of disclaimers real quick. First of all, this is an introduction. Despite the length of this presentation, by the end of it, you won't be an expert on homelessness. Please do feel free to talk with your clients who are experiencing homelessness about the things that you hear in this presentation. Ask if it's accurate, ask what their experiences are. That will be the best way to learn. For my personal background, I've been working with agencies that serve the homeless for about 22 years now, and I am still learning a lot every day. So I can't make you an expert when I myself am not an expert. Second thing, there are a lot of slides in this presentation. We're going to skip over a lot of them. There are a few that I will read word for word, but I put a lot of resources in here. I want to show you where I'm pulling this information from. And I also wanted to give you resources where you could go and do additional reading if you want. So if there's slides that you want to spend more time on, just pause the presentation. But for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over a lot of them. Third, really important, I am going to speak from a client perspective. I'm going to speak from the perspective of someone who's been homeless for a couple of years and who therefore has not gotten what they need from the homeless service system. So I'm going to be critical, I'm going to be cynical. I don't agree with everything that I'm going to say in this presentation necessarily, but I do want us to understand how the clients view us and our role in the system. And while I'm doing that, I want everyone to understand, I know I can't design a better system than the one we have now. If you gave me unlimited power and money, I could design a different system, but it would still be very flawed, I'm sure. So when I'm being sarcastic and cynical and everything else, please remember, I don't necessarily agree with everything that I'm saying there, so don't think that I'm really arrogant. Finally, last part of the introduction, in terms of terminology, I am going to speak about the homeless and the poor and clients interchangeably. I am going to try when I can to use more person-centered phrases such as somebody who is experiencing homelessness, but that phrase and others like it are really long and cumbersome, especially when you're dealing with a presentation that's already a couple of hours long. So sometimes I will just use the shorthand, and I'm not trying to be derogatory in any way. So let's move on. This slide here sums up what we're going to be talking about today. Those individuals who are street homeless often reject what is being made available by the social service system. Alternatively, we also might say that service institutions have proved incapable of reaching this group in a meaningful way. Either way, those on the street highlight not only the overall failure of our society to provide for the poor, but also failures of specific institutions charged with that task. The former leaves us with the suggestion that we ought to provide more services to those who are poor and homeless. But the latter adds an important nuance that questions exactly what kind of services we ought to offer and how we ought to organize the institutions that provide them. So that is what we're going to be looking at today. Now, as I said, we're going to talk briefly about culture. There are two definitions that I'm going to use in this presentation. The first is that culture is a collective shared response to certain memories. And so if you talk about American culture, you're talking about how this country was founded. It was born out of revolution, Declaration of Independence, saying that all men are created equal. It didn't include women in that, and it didn't even include all men. But there are certain ideas embodied in that have had a huge impact on shaping American culture. More recently, we've had, the 9/11 attacks, which have affected how American culture deals with safety and security and issues like that. Now, that is not the primary definition that we're going to be using today, but it is very important to keep in mind, because we are going to be contrasting the homeless culture with American culture. So you have the overarching American culture, and then you have different type of culture. This is a collective shared response to a shared situation. And so youth culture would be an example of this. You have a bunch of people who are 14 to 18 years old, say, and it is their age and the experiences they're going through and hormonal changes and going through school and all this kind of stuff. Those are the kinds of things that unite that group. And 10 years from now, they're going to be a much more diverse group. So when we talk about homeless culture, this is the sort of thing we're talking about, where you take a whole bunch of diverse people and put them in a similar situation, and they have to respond to that situation, and a culture develops out of that. So one of the questions, usually I present this at conferences so we can have more discussion. Unfortunately, obviously, we can't do that in this setting, but one of the discussion questions that we deal with is, how do you define homeless? And usually the answers that I get focus around sort of the funder HUD type definition. Are you in a shelter? Or are you on the streets? Place not fit for human habitation? Those kinds of things. When you talk with the homeless about when they became homeless or what homelessness is, it's a lot more focused on quality of life. One of the conferences where I was presenting, a woman spoke up. She works with single homeless mothers, and she said she asks this question to all of her clients, and the most common answer she gets is that they became homeless when they lost access to a kitchen. So if you're thinking of a mother, losing access to a kitchen means you no longer control what your kids can eat. You can't teach them basic life skills. You don't have the ability to bake birthday cakes or special foods for celebrations. You can't pass on family recipes. There's a big quality of life issue there. So for the sake of this presentation, I am going to define homelessness as not having a place to do things in private. And this is very different from the definition that you're probably used to, because you have to deal with, again, funders and all kinds of issues like that, and no funder would provide money based on this definition. But this definition does give a really good idea of what it is that the homeless experience day to day. So here are a bunch of things that I, as a housed person, can do in my own home. Assuming I'm not playing the music too loud and I'm not getting in arguments and fights that are causing the neighbors to call the police, I can do all this stuff. I can drink, I can get drunk, sleep until noon the next day, use the bathroom whenever I want, take showers, all that kind of stuff. I can even do some of this outside my house as long as I'm still on my own property, such as the garage sale. This is all stuff that is very difficult for homeless individuals to do, especially in private. Now, here's an example. I love the St. Paul Public Library system, especially their main branch, downtown St. Paul, where I found this sign. So I'm not trying to be critical of them. This is something that is common to all kinds of institutions. But if you look at this sign and you see the 4 rules there, and you think, if you or I, as a stereotypical housed person, went into the bathroom, someone saw us going in, which of those 4 rules would someone think we were most likely to break? Now, when I ask this at conferences, it's pretty much unanimous. They think I might enter the bathroom with library materials. And then I say, okay, think about your stereotypical homeless person, dirty clothes, some body odor, unkempt, that kind of thing. What rule do you think they would break when they went into the bathroom? And everybody says, well, the other 3 rules. And that's pretty much universal anytime I ask that question. Now, please recognize that only one of those 4 rules has anything to do with what a library does. And that's the rule that people think I'm going to break as a housed person. So you have this situation where an institution is making up a bunch of rules aimed at homeless people that have nothing to do with what that institution actually does. So this is the sort of situation we're going to be talking about, where the homeless are singled out and in a sense harassed just because of the situation that they're in, not because of what they actually do. So when we talk about no privacy, this means that everybody can see you. Now, At Home on the Street is one of the books I'm going to refer to quite a bit. It started actually as a university project. The people working on it were supposed to do a short documentary. They did, but in the process, they learned a lot about homelessness, and they wrote this book. And so they talk about early in the project, they went to a homeless camp, nobody was there, should we film it? And they realized that they were invading somebody's private personal space, but because there were no four walls and a roof and a locked door around this, it wasn't quite the same as my private space. If somebody came into my house without my permission and just started looking around and taking photos of stuff, I would be really offended. But this is the situation that the homeless face, that because they don't have those visible barriers that signal to people, this is my privacy, they don't get to experience that privacy. So, one of the problems with this is that in American culture, there are a lot of labels placed on people. And this labeling theory basically says that if you put a label on somebody, no matter how overly simplistic or stereotypical it is, that gives you the power, at least in your own mind, to judge someone and to explain them. And the definition of homelessness and that label and that stereotype tends to override any other quality or trait that a person might have. And so when somebody is visible, when they don't have privacy, and when American society and American culture judges them, it sees them only as a one-dimensional being. Now, when you look at all these people, you probably don't see homeless, but all of these individuals were homeless at one time or another. This is important to remember, because when you see a homeless person, you may be looking at a great poet or an incredible musician or a great artist or, all these skills, incredible cook, wonderful mechanic, anything like that. But we tend not to see that even in the social service world, where we try to humanize homeless individuals or people who are experiencing homelessness. We don't always do a very good job. We fall into the trap as well of seeing a homeless person and just looking at them as needing housing, and that's our job and that's what we're going to do. So this plays out again against the background of dominant American culture. American cultures, again, going back to the founding of the U.S., you work hard, it's very individualistic. You earn your way in the world, basically. And the flip side of that is that if you don't succeed, it's your own fault because you didn't work hard enough, or you don't have the skills, or you're lazy, or whatever it is. And this is the label that gets attached to many homeless people because of the dominant American culture. So, let's look at some specific ways that the homeless get judged. This is from the book Down on Their Luck. It's another book that I'm going to refer to quite a bit during this presentation. And the authors watched this happen fairly often. Homeless were lining up outside a shelter for dinner. School bus would drive by and the kids would yell insults and throw coins at the homeless. They thought it was funny. They thought it was appropriate because these are homeless. Businesses can also judge you. A lot of business will not allow people who appear to be homeless, who fit that stereotype, into their business, or they will limit how long they can be there. A lot of businesses would prefer to have a well-dressed person not buy anything in their store than have a homeless person in there buying stuff, because they think that having the homeless person there repels other potential customers, whereas having somebody who is well dressed and looks like they're going to spend money, that brings more people in. So again, you have this labeling and some form of harassment that comes from this. Politicians can also judge. This was known as the lurking ordinance in Minneapolis. It has been repealed, which is really nice. But for a long time, the police could arrest somebody on the suspicion that they were going to commit a crime. I never saw hard numbers, but anecdotally, speaking with my colleagues, this law was used disproportionately against people of color and the homeless. Somebody was waiting at a bus stop, for instance. The police could just come along and tell them to move, or they would be arrested. And of course, most of the time, the homeless would cooperate with that. So, just another example about the criminalization of homelessness. Not actually aimed at the homeless this time, though, aimed at the people who try to help the homeless. Okay. And a few more quotes. As I said before, feel free to pause this at any time to look at the quotations. This is a fun one. Slidell Police Department in Florida arrested a gentleman for panhandling and being publicly intoxicated. When they booked him in, they found that he had over $800 cash in his pocket, and so they put this on their Facebook page as a way of educating the public about panhandlers. Now, you are probably in the same situation as me, that when I go out, based on the credit cards I have in my pocket, I'm carrying way more than the equivalent of $800. But if the police arrested me for some minor charge, having a broken taillight or something on my car, and then posted on Facebook how many credit cards I had and what the credit card limits were and things like that, that would be a huge breach of my privacy. I would be extremely annoyed about that. But it's okay to do that with the homeless, apparently. Now, here's a guy who obviously got some of the money and went to the liquor store. He was intoxicated, but he's not spending all of it on liquor. He's still got $800 in cash. What's he going to do with that? I don't know. Maybe he's going to go try to find an apartment. That would be a good thing. Let's encourage him about that. Let's tell him he's doing a really good job, and let's try to give him the resources he needs. Well, no, he's homeless. We're going to publicly hold him up and ridicule him in a sense, just because he's homeless, and we're going to make it as hard as possible. We're going to tell people, no, don't give him money to get off the streets. Now, was he really going to use this money to get off the streets? I don't know, but it's not a fair assumption to say that he was just going to waste it because he was homeless. So, after that, we get on to ourselves, the social service agencies. We also fall into this trap of judging people. This is a sign that was at a Christian mission in Texas, as quoted in Down on Their Luck. And just to be clear, I am a conservative Christian. I'm very open about that. So again, I'm willing to criticize anybody in this presentation. But welcome to this agency. This agency is a Christian ministry to persons who need a meal. A person who comes here for help should realize that he or she has a serious life problem, including bad habits, some of which are willful idleness, lack of self-discipline on the job site, alcoholism, drug abuse, including nicotine addiction, chronic fault finding. Now, you can stop there and just ask yourself, who is the chronic fault finder? The person reading this sign or the person who wrote it? Yes, if you walk through our door, you're homeless and you're obviously incredibly flawed, and it's our job to change you. So, Christian agencies aren't the only ones who do this. This is a sign that was put up by a case manager in a residential building. I, unfortunately, supervised this case manager, and I didn't find out who put the sign up until after she left, and I had to go through her computer files, and I found it on her computer. Part of the reason I didn't know who had put the sign up was because she didn't sign it, which is important. In this residential building, people had their own rooms, but there were shared bathrooms in the hallways, and she didn't like the way people were messing up the bathroom, and so she put this sign up which obviously is kind of threatening. But imagine that you're new to this building, you've been homeless for a while, you come in, you're hoping that this is going to help you get on your feet. You walk into the bathroom and you see this sign, and the person before you left the bathroom in a messy condition. Now you don't know what to do. You don't know whether you should talk to the janitor to ask if he can clean it up, or if you can offer to clean it up. You don't know if this was the case manager or their supervisor who put this up. All you know is that now your housing is in danger because somebody else messed up the bathroom and you happen to walk in behind them, and you don't know who's out to get you. This is not a situation that's going to make you feel very comfortable. So, on top of all this, the homeless will also judge themselves. And this is perhaps one of the most tragic things about homelessness in the American culture. Again, a lot of the homeless grew up in American culture, and so they were taught that if they worked hard, if they were smart enough, they would achieve something. They would have their own house, the American dream, all that kind of thing. Because they have internalized that and those values, when they end up homeless, they feel like they have somehow failed, or that they are inadequate in whatever way. And so a few years ago in 2014, the city of Minneapolis did a survey of panhandlers in the downtown area. They talked to about 33 of them, and one of the questions was, how does panhandling make you feel? And the answers: I feel hopeless, feel like crap, not good, I feel low, really, really bad, I get depressed, confused, down, terrible, lousy person, not good, very low. So you see how this all works together, that the homeless are dealing with a culture and have internalized a culture that labels them, that puts them down, that harasses them, and they bring that to themselves as well. So you can see from the start that homelessness is not easy. It is continually bearing down on people and wearing them down emotionally. Now, as if all this wasn't bad enough, we have more bad news. This judgment can lead to harassment, sometimes quite violent harassment. So, if you look at this chart, the top 5 categories there, by the way, this information comes from the National Coalition for the Homeless. From 1999 to 2015, the FBI tracked lethal hate crimes. The top 5 categories there are considered hate crimes under federal law, and so the FBI tracks the total of people who were killed in each of those categories. Homelessness is not considered a hate crime. If somebody attacks a homeless person because they are homeless, that does not constitute a hate crime under the laws at this time. The National Coalition tried their best to track the number of homeless who were lethally attacked because they were homeless during that same time period, and came up with 528. They assume that they are underreporting that number by quite a bit because they are relying on homeless advocates in different parts of the country to report to them when somebody is murdered. They also are looking at newspaper articles and things like that. But as you can imagine, there are quite a few homeless who just disappear, and we don't know if they're murdered or not. Others who may have been murdered and it's not reported for whatever reason. So the homeless face not only a lot of emotional and verbal and physical harassment over time, they also are actually in a fair bit of mortal danger. And so you have all of this coming together, putting emotional and psychological pressure on the homeless, and they have to decide how they're going to respond to this. So there are 2 possible responses. The first is to try to stay invisible. When you do that, it's very hard to get help because you obviously don't want people to realize that you're homeless. So, brief excursion here into city planning and urban development. What we normally think of as prime space in an urban setting, or even in a smaller town, It's anywhere that has economic or quality of life value, such as city parks, nice housing, things like that. The marginal space, that doesn't have the same value. Industrial areas, rundown parts of the town, so on and so on. So, for the homeless, those are reversed. Prime space is somewhere that is secluded. It's close to the services that they need, so soup kitchens, plasma centers, things like that, things that are not normally in the high-end neighborhoods. And they want to be close to transportation routes, whether that's public transportation, areas that are easy for bikes, or places that you can get from one place to another on foot quickly, so railroad tracks, things like that. These are the places that the homeless want to spend their time if they are trying to stay invisible. The problem is, well, there are a couple of problems. One is that prime space for the homeless becomes prime space for drug dealers and predators and, fill in the blank there. The reason for this is obviously predators, drug dealers, and so on also want to be away from the spotlight when they're doing their business. They also know that the homeless, we'll talk more about this later, don't have a lot of resources, don't have a lot of ways that they can protect themselves. And so the homeless, in trying to stay invisible, put themselves at even greater risk for certain types of exploitation. The other thing is that they have very little control over their own space. If they claim space, if they set up camp, they have no legal right to it, and so they can be put out. Their marginal space can become prime space to the greater community, and so the homeless routine and the homeless housing, such as it is, gets disrupted. And there have been a few examples of this in the Twin Cities lately. When I say lately, over the last few years. The Republican National Convention was held in St. Paul a few years ago, and it was held at the Xcel Energy Center. And if you look at a map from that time, the Xcel Energy Center was directly between the largest homeless shelter for single adults in the city and the county offices where they would have to go to fill out paperwork for benefits and things like that. It was also right in the middle of a lot of the bus routes. And so this was really disruptive to the homeless who were living there and who were trying to get their lives in order. Now, most of the news coverage at the time was focused on the danger of terrorist attacks and things like that. And there was a lot of concern that terrorists might disguise themselves as homeless people. And so the news coverage focused on how can the FBI and the other law enforcement agencies keep the convention safe from terrorists. Most of us homeless advocates and the homeless themselves were talking about how can we protect the homeless from these politicians coming in here. And again, I'm Canadian, so I don't have any allegiance to the Republicans or the Democrats. I'm not trying to pick on the Republicans. But this is what happens. An area that had been safe and normal for the homeless, or as safe as could be, was suddenly disrupted through no action of theirs, and they had no control over it. Another example, the Minnesota Twins, they got a new ballpark a few years ago called Target Field. It's right across the street from an agency called Sharing and Caring Hands, and there was talk about Sharing and Caring Hands having to close down and move because the city didn't want and the Twins didn't want to have a homeless shelter and service agency right across the street from the ballpark, and that all got resolved. Sharing and Caring Hands is still there. So, but this is the sort of thing that the homeless run into when they try to remain invisible. A couple of quotations here, actually, from an archaeologist who was doing some work in St. Paul, and he realized that the areas that he was digging had been used for decades by homeless for their encampments. And as he was digging through these layers of refuse, he was able to piece together what the life of a homeless person was like at different times based on archaeological procedures. And what he found was basically the homeless did stay in these areas because they had certain common characteristics that were really important to them. So this is a really fun one from my hometown. City of Calgary redeveloped part of downtown. It was part of downtown that was very close to the largest homeless drop-in center in the city. They put in new public bathrooms and stuff. And then the homeless, of course, started using the bathrooms, but worse than that, they started sleeping in the bathrooms. And so their response, the city's response, was to close the bathrooms down unless there was a special event. A spokeswoman said, when we were planning the area, we went through an extensive visioning program, which apparently overlooked this homeless drop-in center. After what we've watched and observed, our intentions were clearly different from how these facilities are being used right now. So imagine you are homeless. You have nowhere to sleep. You are carrying your belongings with you every day. You are to the point now where sleeping on the floor in a public bathroom is the best option. That's the good choice. And the city finally notices you. They overlooked you when they were doing this planning for this part of the city, but now they've noticed you. And they said, this is untenable. Having people sleeping on the floors of public bathrooms, this should not be. This is so inconvenient to us. So again, this is why the homeless are not always very impressed with American culture and, or in this case, Canadian culture, and don't feel like they have a lot invested in the system's approach to solving homelessness. So somebody did write back pointing out how ridiculous the city's position was. But this goes on in all kinds of different ways. This photo shows these spikes outside the front door of an apartment building. Those spikes have only one reason. They are there to make sure that a homeless person does not try to lie down there and get out of the wind and the rain and the cold and the snow. We want to make it as unhospitable as possible. Here we have park benches from different parts of the US and Europe. They all have one thing in common. They are designed to become incredibly uncomfortable after about 20 minutes. So the idea is, yes, you can sit for a little bit, but you can't lie down and you can't stay here. If you want to sit somewhere for a long time, you go to a coffee shop or something like that, but you have to be able to spend money to be in a coffee shop. If you're homeless, we just don't want you hanging around here. And a couple of years ago now, the story came out that Fargo, which is about 4 hours from Minneapolis here, had put in benches, and the downtown community partnership specifically said this was because they did not want transients, as they put it, loitering in the high traffic areas. They wanted to make it as uncomfortable as possible for the homeless to be in the areas where they wanted a lot of shoppers going and a lot of people going out to restaurants. So this does happen today. It's going on quite a bit. You can look up homeless blogs like these ones that actually give suggestions to homeless individuals about how to stay invisible, finding the right parking spot so that the police won't tell you to move on in the middle of the night. All those kinds of wonderful skills that the homeless have to develop to deal with the situation they're facing that housed individuals like me do not have to worry about, don't even have to think about. So we move on some more. We've looked at what happens when the homeless try to stay invisible, but we can assume that if you, in your professional capacity or as a volunteer, are talking with a homeless individual, they are not invisible. They're sitting right in front of you and you get to talk with them. There are two problems for the homeless with this. One is that whatever little bit of privacy they had, they have to give that up now, whether it's panhandling or something like that, or if they're coming into an office to meet with a social worker and they have to answer invasive questions. The second problem is that even when they reach out for help with one problem, whether it's housing or healthcare or whatever, they probably have a bunch of issues going on that they need help with. And asking for help with one problem is not necessarily going to solve the other problems. So we're going to look at how this works. Here in Minnesota, we have what's called a Rule 25 assessment. If somebody needs to get into mental health or chemical health treatment, and they don't have the insurance for it, they can get a Rule 25 assessment to have the state government pay for it. And so if you're if you're doing a Rule 25 assessment, you go in, you meet with somebody who you've probably never seen before, and within 10 minutes you are being asked to tell them if you've ever been diagnosed with a mental health problem, or if you've ever been verbally, emotionally, physically, or sexually abused. Yes, isn't that fun? The combined application form is the form people have to fill out to receive financial assistance. And so you have to talk about how much cash or checks you have, how much savings you have. And the problem with this is somebody who is very low income, someone who's homeless or who's destitute or whatever, they should be receiving these services. Those questions are in there on the assumption that there are a bunch of people, probably middle-class people like me, who are making enough that they should be paying for these services, that the government shouldn't be subsidizing them. And so we've got all these questions that are put in there to prevent people from exploiting the system. And the problem is the homeless can't exploit the system because they're the ones the system was set up to help, but they have to answer all of these invasive questions and prove how poor they are. They have to prove that they have no money. And this can be a difficult thing, but again, when they really need the help, when they are in that very desperate economic situation, they have to wait until they can prove all this stuff. It's just one of those challenges to the system that they have to deal with. Now, another quotation from Down on Their Luck. It's important to realize that the homeless face multiple challenges all at the same time. And it's not just a question of getting housing or getting mental health or finding a job. All of those things have to happen at the same time, and there are many more of them. So we'll talk about that. This is a blog from one of the homeless advocates. It is too simple to say that I was going just fine until someone took my shelter away, and now I am in chaos. If someone would give me my shelter back, the chaos would abate. Nonsense. I'm not in chaos. I have a definable set of problems, and giving me shelter won't solve them. It is only a tiny piece. Furthermore, I don't want a cure for my life. Most people who write to me who are homeless chose homelessness. Homelessness was their answer to another problem. A foreclosed home, a lost job, a catastrophic disease which left them bankrupt and disabled, an abusive family, a lack. Alas, this is the hardest thing to explain. Homelessness was a positive step towards solving other problems. And this is one thing that I think we as service providers often overlook, is that a lot of our clients could change their situation if they wanted to. They could move in with family or friends or, whatever. But that doesn't solve their problems because they're not just dealing with homelessness. You can easily move in with somebody who's abusive. They will give you shelter if it gives them somebody to abuse. You can engage in prostitution to get money so that you can get a place. There are all kinds of ways our clients could solve their problems. And homelessness is one option of how to deal with what's going on. And if they're in a situation where homelessness seems like the best option at that point, then their situation is pretty dire, and we're not really there to judge and say, you're doing this wrong. There is no easy answer, and we have to keep that in mind. So here are just a few strands of the web that come together for different people, whether it's employment barriers, housing barriers, lack of social resources, lack of social programs, ongoing harassment, physical health problems. All of these can come together. And what you see in the homeless community that we'll talk about more in a few minutes is that, you probably already know this, there are higher instances of mental and chemical health problems. There are greater physical health problems. There are fewer good job histories among the homeless. And so we're not dealing with one or two things. We're not even dealing with it. Our clients are dealing with it, and they're dealing with a lot all at once. So This first quotation is from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Association, federal agency. They have said that outreach plays a crucial role in work with people who are experiencing homelessness. Why? Look at the last part of that quotation. Because of their experiences, they have no expectation of a positive outcome. Again, if you're dealing with somebody who's been homeless for several years, these programs have been out there. There has been government subsidies, there have been Section 8 housing, all kinds of stuff has gone on, and it's all failed this person so far. There's no reason for them to think that just because we're suddenly stepping in, we as an individual are going to change this entire system and make it work for them. So again, they may not expect anything good to come from this. Now, the second quote I have to explain, this was not my direct client. I supervised the case manager who was working with this client. But this client came to me extremely upset because we hadn't found housing for him. What had happened, we had a scattered site program. He was in our site-based program, temporary housing, and was waiting to go into permanent housing in the scattered site program. And that program was growing. We hired an intake coordinator. The first person we hired was a really bad hire. In her 6 months on the job, she housed 2 people. And this guy was sitting there waiting to get into housing, and he was having to work with this intake coordinator who we found out was completely incompetent. So because this was taking so long and he had health issues where he really needed to get into his own place where he could control the food that he was going to eat, we referred him to another agency that ran a similar program to ours. And at first that went well. He started meeting with them. They started getting through all the paperwork. But then there was miscommunication. He missed meetings or they missed meetings, and it all bogged down. While that was going on, we fired our first intake coordinator, hired a second one, and she did brilliantly. She knew the system. She knew the landlords. She started housing people really quickly. And so this guy was no longer on our waiting list, and he saw all these other people who had been behind him on the waiting list getting into housing. And he came into my office one day and he was swearing and so upset. And this was his statement about how he felt. Because it wasn't just that the system was slow. It wasn't just that the system wasn't efficient. It was that it was deliberately causing problems when we, as part of the system, knew he had health problems. We knew he needed housing. And we had hired an incompetent person, all these things, and he was still stuck there. And there's a really good chance a lot of your clients have run into these same kinds of situations. The good news is, about 2 weeks after he came in and swore at me so much, he was approved for housing. So, and I do have his permission to quote him in this. When I actually asked him if I could use that quote, he burst out laughing and said, "That really captures my personality, doesn't it?" So the story at least has a happy ending, although it took a long time for us to get to that happy ending. Now, something that I've already mentioned, getting help with one problem does not guarantee solving all the other problems. So, brief diversion now into sociology. I'm not sure what the correct phrases these days are for upper class, middle class, working class, so I'm just going to use those phrases. But historically, the upper classes, the wealthy, if you will, have a tendency to focus on the past. Their main time orientation is to what has already happened. This is why you get names and buildings and foundations and things named after the very wealthy. It's a way of being able to say, look where we came from, look at how much wealth we have, look at our prestige. And so it's a lot more conservative outlook. The middle class, those are the people who look to the future. Tell your kid, you need to do your homework. Why? So that you can get good grades. Why? So you can get into a good university. Why? So you get a nice high-paying job. Why? So that you can retire and, not have to worry about things. Kids may be 10 years old and you're already planning their retirement. That's what middle class do. Working class, or the homeless, or the people on the bottom of the economic ladder, however you want to say it, they focus on the present because, as we'll see, there isn't a lot of incentive to plan for the future, and the past doesn't look very good. It's not something they really want to look back on. So when we talk about all these different strands that the homeless have to deal with at one time, all of those coming together becomes very complicated. And so the more complicated something is, the more likely it is that something is going to go wrong. And once something does go wrong, it becomes more significant because of the complexity of the situation. So we're going to talk about why the homeless do tend to focus on the present. This is just a scenario I made up, but you can read through it. I'm sure you'll recognize something similar with a bunch of your own clients. This is the sort of decision-making process that they have to go through just to get through one day. Down on their luck, the writers there argue that it might be argued that if the homeless would only look beyond the moment to the future, if they were not so impulse or present-oriented, they would see the fruits of investing of the future. But the issue is one of articulation between the present and the future. The difference lies not so much in the different orientations to time as to their different futures. Most people of a higher status see a positive articulation between immediate present and their future. They have strong sense that what they do today will yield a tomorrow that is just as good or better than today. So, most social workers are somewhere in the middle class, and so we went to school, we went to college, we got a degree, whatever. We had some sort of plan. But the homeless don't always have that. Most of them, the second paragraph here, most of them have little confidence that their actions today will yield a better tomorrow for them. It is not so much because they are present-oriented, rather it is because the tomorrows they can realistically imagine are not ones that inspire the investment of whatever limited resources they may have scrimped to save. So again, they've been homeless for years. They've seen the system fail repeatedly. They don't have a lot of confidence that things are going to work out better, so there's no reason to plan for the future. Do what you can in the present to make your life as comfortable as possible, which is not particularly comfortable when you're trying to sleep outside and avoid harassment and physical beatings and everything. So this is one of the big disconnects between social workers and the homeless. We have this very linear approach. Okay, you go down to the social service office, you fill out the paperwork, put it in, they're going to process it properly and they won't lose the paperwork, and you're not going to lose your phone and you're not going to run out of minutes. So when they call you to give you housing, you'll be able to go there and you'll find a landlord who's willing to work with you with your background, and you're going to be able to stay stable, and voila, this is what your life looks like. That's how we view it. This is how it tends to look to the homeless. This is what they expect. Something is going to go wrong. It's not going to work out the way it's supposed to. So, as I said, getting help with one problem doesn't guarantee that they're going to solve the other problems. If they are homeless and they're trying to get all their applications in, and then they lose their wallet, their ID, or it gets stolen, or the police take it when they clean out their encampment, anything like that, now you can't apply for housing because you need your ID. And so you're set back however many weeks, and you need the money to apply for a new ID, and on and on and on. So most social services and American culture in general look to Ben Franklin. God helps those who help themselves, early to bed, early to rise, all that kind of stuff. The homeless tend to line up more with Murphy, who said that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And a couple of people added to that, you can never run out of things that can go wrong, and nothing is so bad that it can't get worse. This is the experience and the outlook of many of our homeless clients. So, on that cheerful note, we're going to switch gears here. We're going to move from some of the big macro level considerations of homelessness into some of the more micro level, the dynamics that individuals have to deal with. In the discussion of these individual situations, the micro level, we're going to be talking about margins. This is the distance between a person and homelessness, or the amount of bad luck that someone can absorb before chaos sets in. You can also think of it in another definition of margin as the area right along the edge of society, whether somebody is included or if they've been pushed out of normal society into homelessness. So, as we look at this, there are lots of different types of margins, and if you look down this list, you're going to see that they fall into three basic categories. Some of them are internal or intrinsic to the person themselves, their cognitive skills, their physical health, something that is determined solely by that person and their physical and their mental operations. You also have their wider community. So do they have family support? Does their family have resources that they can pull from? Do they have a large extended family? Things like that. Are they in a community where there are a lot of resources, or are they in a very poor area? And the third area is sort of the environment, not focusing so much on resources, but is this a safe area? Is it a place where their belongings are likely to disappear? Is there a developed transportation system? All of those things have an impact on whether someone becomes homeless, whether they stay homeless, and we're going to look at that over the next few slides. So, one thing to understand that I think gets underestimated a lot, I underestimated it quite a bit, especially early on in my career, is that margin issues are closely associated in many cases, in the majority of cases, with family of origin issues. Now, if you've heard about the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, I think that's what it stands for. I may have gotten one of those words slightly wrong, but the more trauma, the more instability someone experiences as a child, the greater the impact on somebody's life expectancy, their health outlook, their educational outcomes, all those kinds of things. When we're talking about margins, we're basically taking the ACEs study and superimposing an economic layer on top of it, so that along with these negative childhood experiences, if somebody also experiences a lack of resources as they are growing up, or their family doesn't have a lot of resources, the odds of them becoming homeless later on increase dramatically. So all of these margin issues here are predictors for homelessness as one grows up. So things like out-of-home placement, abuse, alcohol or drug use in the home, those are all factored in with the ACEs study, and those are all things that, again, make it harder for someone to operate efficiently and effectively as they grow up. But there are other elements here when we're talking about homelessness as well. When someone is growing up, if their family has to repeatedly relocate, especially if it's because they get behind on the rent, they have to move to another apartment, they do okay there for a while, and then they get behind on the rent again, and they move again and again. There are a couple of issues going on there. One is obviously the family doesn't have a lot of resources. Second, they're probably moving in and out of neighborhoods and in and out of buildings where a lot of the neighbors are in that same boat. So there isn't a lot of community support or community resources when one person gets into trouble. They aren't able to borrow money or borrow somebody's car to tide them over. Along with this, lower quality of education. If you're moving schools a lot, you're not establishing bonds with the teachers, you're switching from curriculum to curriculum, obviously makes it harder. There's a lack of long-term planning. If you're always dealing with a crisis and you don't have the resources to plan out ahead, then you're running into that problem that we talked about earlier, that all your focus just stays on today. And if this is what you grow up with, if this is what is normal, there isn't going to be a lot of expectation in most cases that you are going to get ahead in life. You're always going to be right on that cusp of homelessness and being on the edge of society. So, as I said, this is something that is often overlooked. This is a study from a few years ago in Minnesota. They found that the most common age for the first experience of homelessness was in the 16 to 18-year-old range. Now, if you think about, the ability of a 16 or an 18-year-old to navigate the world without adult help, it's pretty difficult. In my case, I've got 9-year-old twins. We're saving up for college for them, thanks to Obamacare, if that's still around when they hit 18. They'll be able to stay on our health insurance for another however many years. There are buffers that the stability of the home you grow up in gives you. And as you can see the statistics here, when we talk about kids who are becoming homeless at that age, it's usually because they're fleeing some sort of physical abuse or neglect or other type of abuse, whatever it is. So we have this pattern where kids growing up don't have resources, are not given the skills that they need to survive in society as it's set up right now. They learn other survival skills, and that's what they rely on. So as we go through this, this is one area where I put a lot of quotations in, and I'm going to skip through these quotations. You can pause and read them, but it is important to realize that study after study, no matter what demographic you're looking at, women, men, veterans, family homelessness, doesn't matter. If somebody starts off in a home with low margins, they're much more likely to end up homeless. One thing I do want to point out on this slide, that second quotation, there's never been a model of family that can protect people from poverty or social disruption. We tend in American culture to focus very much on the nuclear family and think that that family of origin should provide for the kids, but we run into the big question of what happens when a family, for whatever reason, whether it's poor money management or just a horrible economy, what happens when they are not able to provide and they're not able to protect their kids from homelessness and economic deprivation, things like that. So again, pause these if you want to. I'm not going to stop and read through all of these. There are one or two of these that I want to look at here. And this quotation from Lost in the Shuffle is one of them. I'll look at the second part of the quotation there. For many study participants, the decision to live on the streets was a logical and rational alternative to remaining in a possibly dangerous and unstable home environment. We mentioned this before, that sometimes homelessness is a choice. It's a better option than the current situation. We have to understand that when we're dealing with especially youth who are running away from certain situations. This story, I think, sums it up as well as anything. I worked briefly at People Serving People. It's the largest family shelter in Minneapolis. And Jim Miner at the time was the CEO. He's since retired. But I heard him tell the story a couple of times where he was talking with a young woman, a 19-year-old, who was staying at People Serving People. She had stayed there with her grandmother. She had left. She had come back with her mother. She had left again. She was staying there for a third time, this time as a 19-year-old pregnant mother. And, as Jim said, she grew up thinking that shelter life was normal because that was what she had seen repeatedly from her birth. Now, I'm all for removing the stigmatism around homelessness, but I'm also worried when we start producing a generation of people who think that living in a shelter is normal and that that's all they should expect. At that point, our thinking has gotten so skewed that something has gone wrong. Now, in terms of margins,
I want you to keep this 19-year-old in mind because I'm going to come back to her. But for someone with small margins, any one of these things happening could cause homelessness. If the car breaks down and they can't get to work, or they're a seasonal worker, any one of these things could cause a disruption in their income sufficient enough that they would become homeless. Now, I used myself as an example for this next part. For my kids to become homeless, even for a day, all of this stuff would have to happen at once, or we would have to have a series of really serious problems over an extended period. But for us to become homeless, our home would have to be destroyed. We wouldn't be able to get insurance. All family would have to be out of reach so that we couldn't get them to send us money. Have to lose all our credit cards. You know, it's very hard to imagine this happening. So the margins for some people are much bigger than others. Now, I mentioned we were coming back to that 19-year-old. So we come back to her. What does her unborn child have to do to become homeless? That child just has to be born. As long as that 19-year-old was still living in the shelter when the child was born, the child is homeless. What has to happen for my kids? Well, all of those things I just talked about. So, yes, we sometimes say that anybody can become homeless, and that is true. But it's like a horse race where there's a 3-to-1 favorite and a 70-to-1 long shot. The child of that 19-year-old who is living in people serving people, we can almost guarantee that that child is going to experience homelessness and that they don't have the same resources that my kids are going to grow up with. So, is it possible my kids will become homeless in the future? Yes, it's possible. But based on predictive factors that we can measure, the odds are much more in favor of that unborn child of the 19-year-old who is living in a homeless shelter for the third time in her life and is the third generation. So we have to understand this when we're working with people, even if they're in their 50s or 60s. It's worth asking, what was the household you grew up in like? What, asking respectfully, but recognizing that they may have done an incredible job of surviving for 50 years on very few resources in a way that somebody like me would struggle to do because I don't have the skills to live in that situation. I've got the skills to live in 21st century America, but if you took away a lot of those safety nets that I have, I would struggle as well. Now, I want to spend just a moment talking about Down on Their Luck. I believe I said earlier this is one of the seminal works on homelessness. It was one of the first studies done, and people who do long-term studies now and write about homelessness, if they don't cite Down on Their Luck in their bibliography, they pretty much either didn't do their research or they aren't giving credit where credit is due. So this is one of the foundational books. But what I want to talk about is how the authors came up with their title. They asked a lot of people why they were homeless. And the most common answer they got was, well, because I'm down on my luck. Something has gone wrong, but when my luck changes, I'm going to be okay. I'll get a job, I'll get the car fixed, I'll be fine. Now, imagine if you're in a situation where your housing is based on luck, where you don't have any sort of buffer between you and homelessness, and one thing that goes wrong will throw everything else off track. That's the situation that the long-term homeless face. And it's really important for us who have stable incomes and other resources to recognize that we have a different mindset because we haven't had to deal with this same reality that our clients have. So, moving forward a little bit, one of the challenges that the homeless face is that because they view things as a result of luck, whether they're housed or not, whether they get picked in the lottery to stay in the shelter that night or whatever it is, there's a sense of fatalism that tends to grow up. It's great to have a plan. about I'm going to go fill out the forms, and then I'm going to get a call when my name gets to the top of the list, and I'm going to meet with the landlord, and I'm going to get my housing. Wonderful plan. Again, that's how the social worker in us thinks, where we have this nice linear progression. But if you're thinking, well, the odds of my ID getting stolen and me not having it when I need to actually go and apply, and I have to prove who I am, and I have to pass a background check, those kinds of questions come up. There's a lot of instability involved here. And so there's a fatalism that develops where I can take all the personal responsibility I want. But if there are all these systematic and social forces that are getting in my way and holding me back, and I have no control over them, then it really does become a question of, do I have good luck? Do I happen to make it through the system where before I failed, or where I'm the one person out of 30 in the shelter who's going to get housing? These are the sorts of questions that we have to keep in mind when we're dealing with our clients. Now, we've talked about sort of the macro level. We're on the micro level. We're looking at some of those individual factors on the right-hand side here. So the question of, can they work with staff? Are the staffs, basically, the staff members, are they jerks? Do they really hold their power and say, I'm in charge here, you must respect me, otherwise you're not going to get the services? They have to agree to program participation, assuming that they even meet the target population of the assistance programs in their area. There have to be enough resources to help the number of homeless who are there. And if there aren't enough resources, that individual has to be good enough at navigating the system, whatever the system is set up to do. They have to have the skills to navigate that system to be one of the few lucky homeless. So structural factors and individual factors do interact here in a big way. And addressing one side without addressing the other doesn't work. So this quote from Down and Out in America, that there's homelessness is a factor of structural conditions. We don't have enough housing, we don't have enough resources. Well, let me rephrase that. We probably do have the resources, we just don't use them properly. But anyway, there are structural factors that cause homelessness. But who individually becomes homeless is a result of environment and constitutional or personal factors. So there have always been homeless in the United States, but there is a predictable group who will tend to become homeless. And again, we can predict with reasonable accuracy who is more likely to become homeless and who's less likely. I want to jump down to that last quote, text from my wife. Our son, when he was 3 years old, was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, and my wife went to work getting him onto the state insurance program. The short version of the story is that she was enrolling him just after Obamacare had come out, and MNsure is the Minnesota Health Exchange. And it had a historically bad rollout. It was a really cumbersome, very ineffective computer system. Also, we had just gotten a new laptop that had Windows 8, and I don't know if any of you listening to this have ever tried using Windows 8. I sometimes have asked at conferences where I presented this, who here has tried using Windows 8? And I'll get a few people who put their hands up, and then I would ask, and who has actually succeeded in using Windows 8? And nobody puts their hand up. And I thought that joke would last for about 3 months. 2 years after Windows 8 came out, I was still using that joke, and still nobody was putting up their hand. It was a really horrible operating system, in my opinion. Anyway, the point of all this is my wife trying to sign our son up for health insurance on a computer that used Windows 8. She termed that insanity-inducing. Now, this is a woman who was not sleep-deprived, did not have a major mental health issue, had all the time in the world, within reason, to use her own computer in the quiet of her own home. This is not somebody who has only gotten 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night, working on a library computer with a 1-hour time limit in a noisy space. So the idea that things are set up well for our clients and that if they just follow the steps we lay out, they're going to do well, is an oversimplification. There are a lot of factors, both structural and individual, that will get in the way for our clients. And again, some more quotations that you can look at on your own. It's important to note, too, that when social service agencies struggle or don't meet their goals, a lot of times they will talk about those macro level dynamics that are getting in their way. But when an individual homeless person comes in to talk with their counselor or their case manager, we will not let them talk about those macro level ideas. So, for instance, if a housing program says our goal is to put 100 people in housing this year and they only get 80 in there, you're probably going to hear, among other things, well, the housing market is shrinking, there weren't as many grants available, things like that. And they will be able to explain, sometimes making excuses, but often legitimately saying, here are the reasons that we didn't reach our goal. But if you talk with an individual client and say, why are you homeless? And they say, well, the housing market is really tight and, the government subsidies are not what they should be. We will probably cut them off and say, no, but what are you doing about this? Are you going and filling out resumes? Are you going and, so there's a double standard there that we have to be aware of and we have to make sure we avoid. Now, to put this into perspective, the question, why don't they just get a job? This comes up quite a bit, and a lot of people say this is the answer to homelessness, if people would just go out and get a job. Now, it is generally recognized that if you are able to get a sustainable income that helps pay for, hopefully you get an income large enough to cover rent and food and utilities and stuff. If you do, yes, getting out of homelessness can be fairly easy, but there are a lot of problems with this. Again, we're talking about, in large part, people who probably didn't go to college, and I'm not stereotyping here, please understand that. Again, we're looking at the predictive factors. There are doctors and lawyers who do become homeless for various reasons, but they are a very small minority. Okay? When we talk about the homeless, we're talking a lot about people who are who don't have a lot of job skills, who don't have college educations. So they aren't set up to get the high-paying jobs that everybody wishes they could have. Again, and when they're applying for jobs, they have to pass job interviews. They have to be able to demonstrate that they have an employment history. If they show up at a job interview in dirty clothes, or they lack a telephone or lack regular access to email so that they aren't able to get messages from potential employers, that's going to get in their way. If they're relying on public transit and then they're limited to certain areas of the city where they would be able to work. If you get a full-time job, you're not able to go to the local shelter for lunch, things like that. There are all these potential barriers that add up and make it difficult for somebody to be able to just go and get a job and to step from that into housing. Because of course we know that once you get a job, it's usually 2 to 3 weeks before you get your first paycheck. And even then, your first paycheck is not going to be enough for damage deposit, first month's rent, all that kind of thing. Getting a job and using that to get out of homelessness means, first of all, getting a job, which is challenging enough, but then keeping the job while you were homeless for, at least a month, maybe a couple of months, because once you have the money, available, you still have to actually find a landlord who will rent to you. You have to pass background checks. You have to wait for an apartment to come open. All of these things can delay it. And so we're not just saying, why not get a job? We're saying, jump over a bunch of obstacles just to get a job, then jump over a bunch more obstacles to find housing. And again, that can be very difficult even for people who are extremely competent. For people who have not learned the skills in the organization to be able to do this, or who are going to run into bad luck, such as their phone getting stolen or their car breaking down, it's that much more complicated. It's also important to recognize that the types of jobs that many of the homeless do get are temporary. They're more dangerous than regular work. They don't have unemployment or workers' compensation benefits, anything like that. So the question of getting a job is more confusing, more convoluted, more challenging for a homeless individual than for somebody who does have stable housing. And just a note here from down on their luck. A lot of the homeless do work. A lot of them are looking for work. It's just that the work that they do does not pay enough for housing. And we have to recognize that as well. So, from Checkerboard Square, asking the poor if they want to work is like asking somebody. And now we're going to look at the link between mental health or mental illness, chemical dependency, things like that, and homelessness. Now we know statistically there's a correlation between homelessness and these conditions, and there is a tendency to think that the homelessness is the result of these conditions, but that is not always true. It is sometimes true, but quite often the homelessness itself is the cause. Now, this has been recognized by the federal government, SAMHSA, in their Tip 55 book. Homelessness itself is a risk factor for mental and substance use disorders, given the many life challenges and disruptions that people who are homeless face. For example, we've talked about a lot of these: stress, loss of social connectivity, increased threats, harm through victimization, exposure, and deterioration of health status. So it's important to recognize, especially when you're dealing with somebody who has been homeless for a long period of time, all of the dynamics that we've been talking about will wear them down. And there's a reason that statistically people who are homeless have a much shorter life expectancy, shorter by decades, not just by years, than people who are stably housed. This article is not specifically about homelessness, but it does underline the connection here between homelessness and stressful situations like that with mental illness. And what this study found was that residents of violent urban neighborhoods often experienced PTSD similar to those who had been in war zones. Now, that would include people who are homeless, who are under constant threat of physical attack or harassment or abuse. All of that comes into play. But the thing to remember here is that unlike somebody who has previously been in combat and is now in a safe situation, the PTSD can hopefully be treated and the severity reduced. But if somebody is currently homeless, there, as this final sentence says, there's nothing about the post-traumatic stress that they are experiencing. As you are working with them, they are actively being traumatized still. And so when you're working with an individual who has been homeless for a long time, it is good to recognize that this dynamic is in play in the background, because it may not be overt and obvious. Now, the authors of At Home on the Street bring this out really well, especially as it relates to the treatment that we tend to offer to people who are mentally ill. The management of mental illness is structured such that it can be nearly impossible for a person who is mentally ill and homeless to get aid. It requires keeping appointments, going through ordered steps, filling out forms, as it says here, all kinds of things. Now, if you have somebody who can help you keep track of your appointments and keep track of your medications and help you fill out forms, you can navigate this system. But if you think of somebody who is seriously handicapped, whether it's a developmental disability or a mental health issue, how do they navigate this system of bureaucracy? Think back to my wife's text about trying to enroll our son in health insurance using a system and a software package that didn't work. Even somebody who is sane didn't have the skills to do this. So if you're asking somebody who has lower skills and more barriers in the way, there can be some significant problems with them accessing and then responding positively to mental health services. So again, a few more individuals that, or a few more quotations about individuals who don't work well within the system, or alternately, for whom the system does not work well. So now I want to come back to this quotation that I started with, which again highlights the question we're talking about. Are we providing services in a way that understands the dynamics and the culture of the people who need those services? So let's talk about social services for a little while. Social services are set up to help people overcome individual barriers, but there are several reasons why we can fail at this. So taking this chart from Down on Their Luck, there are different ways that organizations and agencies can respond to homelessness. One is accommodative, where an agency just tries to meet the basic needs of somebody who is dealing with homelessness. And the next one is restorative, where they're not just meeting basic needs, but they're trying to move the person forward so that that person is able to meet their own needs. Now, those are the two main responses by social service agencies, but there are other responses as well. Exploitative, I am not thrilled with that label, but that's the one that Snow and Anderson used in Down on Their Luck. Exploitative does not necessarily mean mercenary. It doesn't mean that the agency is harming the homeless that it deals with. It just means that that agency benefits somehow from the interaction. So I'll talk about this more, but this would be like a day labor scenario. Then we have the exclusionist and expulsionist approach. That's usually neighborhood associations and things like that who don't want the homeless in their neighborhood. And then containment, that would be law enforcement harassing the homeless if they go to the wrong part of town, that type of response. So let's look at this a little more closely. The accommodative agencies, as I said, they don't do a lot to move individuals out of homelessness. They meet the basic needs. So this might be a homeless shelter that provides place to sleep, place to store clothes, provides 1 or 2 meals a day, but doesn't have case managers to help people find work or to find housing. Restorative agencies do deal with some of these other issues. They may provide chemical and mental health treatment, job training, things like that. But as we've seen before, the homeless are often dealing with multiple issues at once and trying to solve multiple problems. And so the one problem or the 2 problems that that agency deals with may not be enough to end the person's homelessness. And homelessness may not be the primary focus of that agency. Residential drug treatment program, for instance. I've known a lot of homeless individuals who will work the system to get into a treatment program, not because they want to get clean, but because in a residential program they have a safe place to live. So this comes up quite a bit, but what these agencies have to remember when they're dealing with homeless clients is that there are all these other dynamics that we've already talked about. Some of these we've talked about, some of them we haven't. Sleep deprivation is a big one. If you're talking about somebody who is sleeping in a shelter, or I should say staying in a shelter, If they're hyper aware, if they've been attacked before, if they're worried about their stuff getting stolen, it's very hard to get a good night's sleep. And if you're doing this for a year or two at a time, or you're sleeping outside in the elements and trying to stay warm when it's below freezing or whatever, they're not going to get a lot of sleep. They may not be getting good nutrition, so their overall health and their overall mental abilities are going to decline. You also have to recognize there are things going on like the side effects of medication. If somebody is worried about being attacked and they're prescribed a medication that makes them drowsy and therefore more vulnerable to assault or attack or robbery, the odds are that they are not going to take that medication. So the agencies that are dealing with homeless clients have to recognize that the homelessness brings in additional dynamics that are not there when you're dealing with somebody who has a safe, stable place to live. Now, this first slide is, or this next slide, sorry, is a couple of quotations from a blogger who has been homeless and who offers advice not only to those who are currently homeless, but to social service agencies. And he makes this point about sleeplessness being overlooked by so many social service workers. And this article goes on to say that sleep deprivation has also been linked to an increase in mental illness, drug abuse among teenagers, higher rates of violence and aggression, schizophrenia-like symptoms. So all these other things that we've already talked about. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. As we go through some of these slides, I can skip over them faster and faster because we've already talked about this stuff. But you start to see how all of this is interwoven together and how it's important for us to not try to separate them too much. Okay. Now, exploitative agencies, like I said, plasma centers, temporary labor, businesses, pawn shops, stuff like that. These agencies focus on their own well-being and their own profit, but because of the nature of their work and where they're located, they tend to do a lot of business with homeless individuals. There are times when social service agencies start functioning in this way. For instance, when we change our programming, when there's a grant available, but we have to adjust our programming to qualify for the grant, at that point, we have started becoming exploitative in the sense that we are using our clients in order to get money. We are not pursuing the money so that we can provide the programming that we think is best for our clients. And I know that can be a touchy subject, but it is a dynamic that we have to really be honest about when we are looking at how we're going to set up our programming and how we're going to fund it. Now, in situations where you have increased numbers of homelessness, one of the things to remember here is that this will overwhelm the accommodative agencies, and it forces restorative agencies into a more accommodative role. So if you have an agency, we had this situation a few years ago in Minneapolis where one of the agencies had a chapel that was meant to be a place of religious service for the homeless. But there were so many homeless, they basically turned it into an extension of the shelter. And the goal of providing a place where people could be married or they could have funeral services or things like that got overwhelmed because it was very hard for a religious organization to tell the homeless, we're too busy serving God to give you shelter. That doesn't go very well. So as the numbers of homeless increase, it creates strain throughout the system. The accommodative agencies, the shelters will fill up. They won't be able to meet all the needs. The food shelves may have to limit how much food they give to each person coming in. The restorative agencies are trying to meet the needs of more people, and so they aren't able to put as many resources into each individual case. And the exclusionist and containment agencies will become more vocal at saying, oh, all these homeless are coming in, we need to do something about this. And by do something, they don't generally mean solve the problem, although they sometimes do. But if they're really exclusionist and containment, they say, We just want the problem to go somewhere else so we don't see it. So part of the problem here is that, again, clients are dealing with multiple issues at once, trying to juggle a lot of balls, and agencies rarely help with all of those issues. We tend to deal with 2 or 3 things at most. And so you've got a homeless client who's not only dealing with us, but they're dealing with several agencies and trying to coordinate all of that. And if you've ever tried to coordinate multiple things for one of your clients, you'll realize how difficult that really can be. So we have that problem. We have the problem as well that social services are not always service oriented. Historically, social services have been a way of controlling the homeless and the undesirable elements of society. They are set up in certain parts of the city to attract the homeless there. They are not allowed to set up in other parts of the city. They have to cooperate with different regulations and stuff like this. So one experience I had, which I'm not very proud of, but illustrates this point really well. I was the manager of a homeless shelter, and part of the shelter's agreement with the neighborhood association when the shelter was founded was that the shelter would not allow clients to congregate outside and just loiter. So we were clear people couldn't come to the building until about 10 minutes before we opened, and they had to be off our property within 10 minutes of us closing in the morning. And this worked pretty well, actually. The residents, the clients, they weren't thrilled with this rule, but they understood it, and they were really cooperative with it. Until somebody in the neighborhood got new furniture and put their old furniture out in the alleyway. And so the residents of the shelter got all this furniture, brought it, and set it up on the patio. And they actually did a really nice job. It did not look ratty. It didn't look second rate. It looked like a very welcoming living room that you might want to go and visit yourself, except it was just on the front porch. And the director of the whole agency came to me as the manager of the shelter and said, this is going to get us in a lot of trouble with the neighborhood association. This violates our agreement. You have to get rid of that furniture. And I didn't want to, but I did. I waited till everybody left, got the van, loaded everything in, drove it off, dumped it somewhere, can't remember where. And that night when the clients came in, they knew what had happened. And they came to me and they were extremely upset, understandably. And they said, can you believe it? Somebody stole the furniture from a homeless shelter. How low can you get? And I, of course, said, you're right. That's terrible. I can't believe somebody did that, because I didn't want to admit that I and my social service agency had sided against the homeless and said, you can't have nice furniture. You're homeless. You shouldn't be able to sit around and just be able to enjoy the same luxuries that everybody else has in their home. No, you're homeless. You don't have privacy. You're not allowed to have this. So, like I said, not my shining moment as a social worker. But this is the sort of thing that social service agencies, the sort of situations we sometimes find ourselves in. And we do have to recognize that sometimes we don't serve the homeless. We serve some other purpose. We'll talk more about this later, but also the homeless, a lot of times when they engage with social services, it's not really by choice, and it's not on the basis of equality. It's because they feel like they're being forced into it. So, a few quotations here just about how the homeless tend to view social service agencies, or how social service agencies really do operate as a control on the homeless. Again, social service agencies, when we do this, it means we're not always service oriented. We often talk about being client centered, but then when the client doesn't want to engage with us, we believe it's their fault, not our fault. We talk about them being resistant or manipulative, things like that. So we're not always as focused on the clients as we would like to be. And this quote from Peckerberg Square just underlines, Usually when middle-class people go to the doctor or decide to check themselves into treatment or something like that, a lot of times it's by choice. With the homeless and with the economically disadvantaged, a lot of times it's because they need to do that. It's a requirement to get some sort of help, to get something, some need met. And so there's an inequality that's built into the system when you're dealing with the homeless that we may not be aware of from our side of the desk, or if we are also receiving social services, we may be receiving those services in a different context. So, I love this first quote here. Entire careers are built on providing services within the continuum of care paradigm for those who are homeless. It would be quite a personal feat for someone to subvert the very orientation by which she or he is employed. Somebody commented, I was in New York at a conference and I heard someone say that there is now a master's degree in homeless service provision. And I thought, that's it, it's over. So we can talk all we want about ending homelessness, but if you've spent 8 years in university getting a degree in homeless management and you have whatever the student debt would be from that, you don't want to end homelessness until you've paid off a large chunk of that debt. You are at that point benefiting from the existence of homelessness. And this is one of the challenges. Very, very few of us could afford to be full-time volunteers to try to end homelessness. We need to feed our families. We need to provide for our own shelter. So we need to get paid. But as soon as we do that, we benefit from this system of homelessness. And we benefit probably, we can benefit from it immediately, whether we end anybody's homelessness or not. And that is a dynamic that our clients are very aware of. They know we get paid for this. We'll talk about that a little more as we go through this. We can also be inconsistent in our approach. Again, we talk about the homeless as being like us. We can say anybody can be homeless, but then we do treat the homeless differently from other people. A lot of times when people find out what I do professionally, they will ask me, what about panhandlers? Is it okay to give them money? And I used to give sort of the standard professional answer and say, no, you shouldn't give them money because they might use it for drugs or alcohol. Better to donate money to the homeless agencies and direct people to go there, or hand out socks or snacks or whatever. But not a good idea to hand out money. That's what I used to say. Now when people ask me if they should give money to the homeless, my answer is do whatever you want. And the reason, there are a couple of reasons I give that answer, but the main one is that I realized how incredibly hypocritical I was being by saying, no, you shouldn't give them money. The reason that it was hypocritical was if you come to my house for dinner, or if I'm out at a restaurant with you and I'm picking up the tab, there's a really good chance that somewhere along the line you're going to be offered a bottle of wine, or I'll ask if you want something to drink. In that situation, there's not a question of will the money be used for alcohol. I've already got the alcohol there, and I'm actively offering it to you. Why is it okay in that situation? Well, it's because you're housed and I'm housed, and housed people are allowed to drink. But the homeless people, no, they might go out and, might wind up in Slidell and be panhandling, and they might have $800, but no, we can't let them have alcohol. So I realized that it was hypocritical in that sense. It was also hypocritical that I was trying to end the stigma of homelessness and at the same time saying, well, they're probably drug addicts out there and they're probably going to use money for alcohol because they're irresponsible and they won't save their money. So please don't misunderstand me. When I tell people do whatever you want, I do mean that. If somebody really feels strongly that they should not give out money and that they want to give out socks, or they want to tell people where the homeless shelter is, or they want to drive people to the homeless shelter, I'm fine with that. I have no problem with that. What I have a problem with is us as social service agencies saying that we are trying to help people and then we inadvertently stigmatize them. it does not do any good, and we have to be really careful about how we approach the things we say to people. Now, we can also be inconsistent with how we view our clients and their actions. I've worked for several agencies that do not provide bus tokens. They just don't have it in their budget for that. And usually the comment is, well, our clients are resourceful. They'll figure out ways of getting where they're going. And when we say that, we don't stop to think that the resources they have are their bodies and the medications that they have. Some of them do have more resources. They're physically fit and able to walk where they're going, or they're able to get a job without too much trouble. But a lot of our clients, their resources are limited, and so they're going to sell their medications, and then we get upset about that. Well, they're not taking their medication; they're doing illegal stuff. Yeah, because we didn't help them with a bus pass, and they had a difficult choice to make. So, social services, we have to be very careful about how we deal with our clients, and that's the whole point of this presentation, is to help us deal with them appropriately based on their culture and their life situation. So again, another quotation about reassimilating people into normal society, when on one hand we say they're just like us, and on the other hand we say that they need professionals like us to help them overcome their situation. So, social services do tend to work on certain assumptions that don't line up well with homeless culture. We assume that the homeless need us, and so on and so on, and finally that the paperwork must be filled out properly. This is a nod to, among other things, I was very briefly a financial worker for one of the counties in the Minneapolis metro area. It turned out I was really horrible at that job. Part of the reason was I was willing to process paperwork that hadn't been filled out properly if I knew that the person who had filled it out really needed cash assistance. And that's not the way the system is set up to work. It's set up to make sure the paperwork gets filled out properly. It's not necessarily set up to help people. If somebody gets help at the end of filling out paperwork, that's a benefit. That's more than the system actually is set up to do. So, here are some assumptions that social service agencies tend to make, and here is the reality that the homeless deal with. Again, we often assume that homelessness and drug use causes homelessness, and really alcohol and drug use are a response to this depressing, chaotic, boring situation. And I will throw in, I'll talk about this more later, but alcohol and drug use are a big element of the social life of homelessness. So if you abstain from drugs and alcohol, you cut yourself off from a large part of the homeless community. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I want to spend a little time on that third one. The traditional family structure is most desirable. I put this in because during my time at the family shelter, if a man and a woman and a child came in and they were what they considered a family unit, they would only be allowed to stay together if both the adults were on the child's birth certificate, or if they could produce a marriage license. So if you had a woman with her child and her boyfriend of 10 years, it didn't matter. He couldn't stay with them because he wasn't part of the family as the system set it up. Now, I understand why that rule was in there. We didn't want prostitution going on in the shelter. We didn't want abusive boyfriends and things like that. But we all know that a marriage certificate is not a good defense against abuse. Things are set up to deal with traditional family structures, and a lot of the homeless and even a lot of house people don't fit into a traditional family structure. So sometimes our services are based on outmoded social norms and social conventions. That fourth one we're going to talk about more in a few minutes in more detail, so we'll skip over that. So the upshot of all this is that when the homeless deal with us, we think we look like this white knight who's going to come in and save the situation. And what we really look like to our clients is this. I got to thank my friend John Petroskas at the Department of Human Services for providing this illustration for me because it's absolutely perfect. Let me put it in a context that maybe you will understand a little more clearly. So this is a sign that's near my house, and I'm assuming that nobody has paused the video at this point so that you can write down that number and call and get this wonderful job. Now, when I've done this presentation at conferences, I've pointed out to people, nobody's writing this number down. Why not? And the universal answer is, it sounds too good to be true. There's got to be a catch. So think about what you're offering your homeless clients. Are you offering them a Housing First program where they get their own place and it doesn't cost them anything, and they're going to receive services, and they're going to get food stamps, and whatever the services are in your area that you're offering them? Are you telling them that if they come into your treatment program, they will get sober and be clean and be able to get housing and be able to get a job? We have to be careful how we phrase this. I've worked in housing programs where we do offer subsidized housing, and it doesn't cost the person everything, or it doesn't cost them anything. And they usually come up with questions like, are you getting a cut of the money out of this? Do you get a commission on everybody you put in housing? It sounds too good to be true. And so we have to be careful how we explain what we're offering and make sure the clients understand that we are not operating as an exploitative agency at this point, that they really will benefit from this, and they're not just a tool in somebody else's money-making scheme. So again, you can start to see why people are not always that thrilled to work with us, because they think there's some catch or something hidden that's going to trick them out later. This is an example of this happening. This happens, unfortunately, quite a bit in Minnesota, just because of the way the federal programs and the state programs don't interact very well. If somebody goes into subsidized housing under the state program in Minnesota, their cash assistance gets cut, but under the federal program, it's still counted as income, so their food stamps also get cut. This is another one of those things that we need to make sure we've thought through it and we explain well, because if we don't explain this, it can have serious consequences. Again, another personal example, not my shining moment as a social worker again. I was working with an agency that had just started. In fact, they had me founding their scattered site program. And we ran into this issue where if somebody was receiving social service benefits through the federal government, they did have to pay most of their income to cover their rent or to help cover their rent. And this was not properly explained to my agency at the county level. So we started putting people in housing, and one of the people I put into his own place was a 22-year-old guy, very sweet, wonderful guy, respectful, physical disability, came from a family without a lot of means, had been in and out of homelessness for a long time. And we put him into this program and told him, you won't have to pay anything. And it had not been explained to us that, yes, he would have to pay over $600 a month. And so we kept going back to the county and saying, you're not paying us enough to cover his expenses. And after 3 months, finally somebody said, well, he has income. Here is how this part of the program works. So by the time we were told what was going on, I had to go back to him and say, okay, you now owe us $1,800. You have to pay that back. He was at that point only going to be able to get about $92 a month in cash. And so here's this 22-year-old, and I've been making these promises to him and setting things up really well. And then I come back to him and say, well, out of your $92 a month, you have to pay back $1,800 to this agency that told you how much good we were going to do for you. And he worked with us for about 3 months, he really tried, but he realized it just didn't make financial sense for him. And one day he just walked out of his apartment and left all his belongings there. And the system as a whole failed him. And like I said, I'm not proud of this. This wasn't my glowing moment, but I was a part of the system. I was not the only weak link here, but this is the sort of thing that happens if social service agencies overpromise and don't pay attention to what they're doing and don't make sure they know how things are really going to work out. So another quotation you can look at. The upshot of this section is that a lot of times our social services, the way we offer them, really do not line up well with what the homeless want. They want privacy like us. They want to have the same rights as us. They want to be able to make the same decisions as us. They want to be able to choose their friends the way we do. All right, now the good news is we are heading into the home stretch of this presentation. So after all this doom and gloom that I've been piling on you for the last 2 hours, I wanted to end with some good news. As I've been saying throughout this presentation, individuals who have been homeless for an extended period of time have really become enculturated into this homeless culture, and that's what these two quotations talk about. But there are some good, positive, healthy aspects to this homeless culture. So for this last part, I'm going to rely a little bit on Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. Now, I never had to study Maslow. I've never actually read his stuff, so I'm just using his hierarchy as a way of organizing our thoughts. So if I misrepresent him in any way, I do apologize to him and his descendants. But as we look at this, the most basic need, according to Maslow's hierarchy, is safety. And homeless culture is kind of ambivalent on this one, because the homeless are safer when they stick together and when they try to stay invisible, but they are also at risk from each other, either for violence or harassment, the pecking order, or stealing things or whatever. And there are predators in the homeless community just like there are predators anywhere else. So the homeless are in this weird in-between situation where they have to trust and distrust their fellow homeless at the same time. Although overall, they're probably safer when they're with their friends than when they're on their own. Now, a couple of quotations from Owen Street that make this point. There is a lot of posturing that goes on in the homeless community, but generally the homeless try not to get into physical confrontations just because that wastes a lot of time and energy for them. It's better to be able to find other ways to protect their reputation so that they don't get picked on or look weak. Now, physiologically, this is not very good news, unfortunately. The homeless have higher rates of chronic health conditions, lower life expectancy, and so on and so on. We've talked a little bit about this before, and the statistics are fairly easy to find out there, so I'm not going to say a lot more about that. But I will point out again that the challenge of finding safety can put the homeless in dangerous situations, whether they're by themselves or with their friends. So, one of the problems for social service workers is that the survival techniques that the homeless need in the homeless culture don't translate well into being housed and living by a standard lease and things like that. So when we're talking about putting people into housing and when we're discussing this with our clients and getting them ready to move, it is important that we keep in mind that they are going to be switching cultures, and we need to be ready to help them do that. So keep that in mind as you work with your clients. And don't be surprised if things don't always work out as smoothly as we would hope. But the next level, belonging, this becomes much more positive. The homeless community as a group provides validation, relationships, protection, and resources. The validation comes because people understand that they are not the only ones in this situation. Again, dominant American culture says it's their fault that they are where they are. But when they talk with other homeless individuals, they realize that there are flaws in the system that are affecting a lot of people, not just them. We can see here the belonging is also, it has to do with the resources that one either can control or the ones that a person knows how to access. So when you're in community, especially the homeless community, if somebody offers you help, you're expected to reciprocate in some way or at some time in the future. And if you're the one who has the resources, then you're in a position of power because you can share those resources with other people, or if you need to, you can withhold them. And it makes it easier for you to be able to access other resources in the community. Now, Paul Piff and his associates have done a bunch of research on this, and his studies are in the bibliography at the end of this. I do recommend watching his TED Talk. It's educational and it's very funny in some ways. But he and his associates did a bunch of experiments to see how money affected people. Basically, they found that those who perceived themselves to be richer, from a higher social class, or more self-reliant, tended to be meaner than other people. So those from lower social classes who perceive themselves to be from lower social classes, at least, which includes the homeless, are more likely to share. They're more generous. They're better at picking up on other people's moods. They're more honest, more generous, and altruistic. In general, again, there are exceptions to this. But again, this is part of homeless culture where it's much more communal, much more sharing than the general American culture. In terms of belonging, a lot of researchers, when they look at homeless culture, they notice that there's a very dense interpersonal network. People rely a lot on face-to-face communication, even if they have cell phones and they can do texting and things like that. The homeless community is much more interactive, personally face-to-face than a lot of other parts of American society. And it's interesting to note here that street people often suffer depression, anxiety, boredom when placed in other circumstances where they're geographically separate from their peers. And so as social workers, we sometimes, without thinking about all of the implications, we tell our clients you have to avoid people, places, and things that lead to relapse. You have to leave the street culture behind. You have to go and develop a new support network, things like this. And that goes very much against the community values and their own social needs that they've developed over the last few years while they've been in the homeless community. So this is an important aspect for us to keep in mind, again, as we're preparing to help people move into housing, that this is going to be a shift for them to now have their own space that they can control. Okay. Again, just a couple more quotations from different places that talk about the importance of relationships among the homeless community. Now, esteem is, again, something that American culture does not bestow on the homeless community because, again, American culture values independence, self-reliance, wealth, and homelessness doesn't embody any of those. And so it undermines the homeless view of themselves as valuable and worthwhile. However, there are ways within the homeless community that you can maintain your self-esteem. And this, again, involves having resources, sharing them, knowing how to navigate the system. There are different ways that people can maintain their place in the pecking order. Now, I know for myself in the past, one of the most frustrating things has been having homeless clients who say, well, I'm not like these other people. And I know from talking to other social workers that this really annoys them as well. When they say, we're not like these other people, I don't need you, you can't teach me anything about homelessness and stuff like that. In some ways, I've come to realize that this is a very healthy attitude for the homeless to have, because they are still saying, I have value, I can make decisions for myself, I can take care of myself. They haven't just completely succumbed to the idea that they're worthless, they can't achieve anything, and they need somebody to do things for themselves. So it's important. I know it can be challenging when you run into those attitudes, but it's important not to just take an antagonistic approach to it. So another issue with the self-actualization, though, is to understand that homeless culture is incredibly boring. It's just a part of everything that happens to the homeless. Now, boredom can rob incentive and imagination, and just about everything the homeless have to do in terms of getting out of homelessness is boring. Lining up for services, answering the same questions over and over again, filling out forms, waiting in offices, all of this stuff. It's boring. You probably get bored doing intakes, asking the same questions of different people. Imagine if you were always answering the same questions over and over for different people to get into services that you're not even sure are going to help you. It is a really difficult way to live, and At Home on the Street makes this point in a couple of ways, talking about how drugs and alcohol are actually a way of dealing with the boredom. Drugs and alcohol, again, are sometimes a solution to homelessness. They aren't the cause of it, they are a result of it. So as we move on here, there are different ways that this can be combated. There are some social service agencies, they probably wouldn't call themselves social service agencies. I shouldn't use that term in this context, but there are different organizations that are set up to help the homeless express themselves, use their gifts and talents, be able to show that they do have talents and abilities. And this falls into again, the self-actualization part of Maslow's hierarchy. Now, one thing I do want to emphasize a little bit here before we end is that homelessness is very communal. Like I've said, it provides a sense of belonging, it provides a sense of worth in its own way, and this can make leaving homelessness difficult. And this is something that I found a lot of social workers really underestimate. So if you've been homeless for a couple of years, there are people in that community who have watched over you, they've watched your back, they've shared their resources with you. And now when you're moving into your own place, you suddenly have a place where people could get a good night's sleep, they can wash their clothes, they can clean up. And we have to be careful that we don't tell our clients that they have to turn their back on all their friends. If we do that, we run the risk of giving them a house but making them still feel like they're homeless. And this goes against the logic of the homeless community. So that homeless logic, which works out very well when you stop and think about it, says, I'm homeless, I rely on my network of friends, and if I don't return help, they will cut me off. So now suddenly I do have this housing, but if something goes wrong, if the landlord discriminates against me, or if the building burns down, or if the government subsidy or the program that I'm relying on ends, or I lose my eligibility, or whatever it is, somebody doesn't file my renewal paperwork properly, I can lose my housing. So then I'm going to be homeless again, I'm going to need these friends, and if I didn't help them while I had a resource, they're not going to help me later, so I should help them while I have housing. So, remember I said earlier that the working class doesn't think about the future? Well, yeah, the homeless do sometimes think about the future, and this is one of the times where they are planning for the future, And it kind of annoys the social workers in the crowd here, because this is the sort of thing that, yeah, it could cost them their housing, but, do we guarantee that they will always have housing? We can't make that promise. We start sounding like that car salesman. So this is one of those tensions that we have to accept, and we have to learn how to operate with in a positive way. Now, if you want to read a really good demonstration of how this tension plays out, how the homeless view these offers that we make to them, and how this develops over time, get the tip book number 55 from SAMHSA. The second half of the book is a series of vignettes of social workers working with homeless clients. The first vignette is about outreach. It's about a social worker meeting somebody in a shelter or a soup kitchen, and over a period of time, weeks or months, talking with them about the possibility of them moving into housing. And the whole vignette, when you read through it, does a really good job of showing the dynamics that we've been talking about today, of the homeless person's suspicions about why they're being offered this housing. They're worried that they're going to be discriminated against because they're homeless. The worry that they're going to have to follow a bunch of rules that nobody else has to follow. All these kind of issues. So I do recommend this book for that reason. Again, this is free. If you go to the SAMHSA website, you can download it for free, or you can order it and they will mail you a copy for free. So that's a really good resource for that. Again, the communal aspect of homelessness makes it very difficult for people to leave. And it makes the transition from homelessness to being housed really hard if you're not used to being on your own, and suddenly you're in your own quiet space and nobody else is around, and it can be very boring and lonely, and honestly it can be quite creepy for some of our clients. So again, there are a few different quotes here that talk about this. I want to spend a little bit of time on this one at Home on the Streets. There are two people that the authors met. There was Lockett and his cousin Motown. Lockett, from the way the authors portray things, Lockett never really fit into the street culture, the homeless culture, the way Motown did, and they hung out with a group on a place called Catch Out Corner. Lockett eventually did get into a treatment program, and as it says here, left the streets, got married, acquired a relatively stable job. When he left and he got into the treatment program, he would sometimes come back to Catch Out Corner. And Motown, his cousin, had been very close to Lockett, and when Lockett showed up, Motown would actually physically threaten him, would be on the verge of attacking him. And the authors assumed that this was because Motown felt betrayed and wished Lockett would stay on the corner. And what Motown actually explained was, no, Lockett has a chance to get off the streets and to get a life better than anything I can imagine. I don't want him coming back here before he's strong enough. If he comes back too soon, we're going to drag him back down. And so Motown's apparent anger and violence towards his cousin was a way of looking out for his cousin. And once Lockett had been away for a while and got stable, he did start coming back again, and Motown and he got along really well. And as Motown notes here, he comes by and hangs with the fellows, helps us out when he can. He knows where he came from. The corner helped him out, and now he helps out the corner. And to me, that's a really wonderful story and a great reminder about the positive qualities that you do find in the homeless community. With all the frustration and all the negatives there, there is some really wonderful examples of what the human spirit can be. So there's my little uplifting moment. I want to end with this quotation.
Shelter, One Man's Journey from Homelessness to Hope, is an autobiography by a guy who had bounced in and out of shelters for several years, and this book covers 1 year of his life, more or less. And he had wound up in another shelter and gone through their programming, and near the end of the book, he gets into his own apartment, and he wrote, "My first night in the room alone feels strange. Without a TV or radio, the deadly silence fills the room, and I can hear every sound outside as the sun sets. I seem to be waiting for a loudspeaker to blast at any minute. It finally hits me that this is what I've been working toward. I must now live on my own without the routines, rules, and help of the shelter." So this is what happens with our clients as they move into their own housing. This is what we hope they get, but it can be a challenging transition for them. So now I can congratulate you because you have reached the end of this. Thank you for staying through the entire presentation. Here's my contact information. If you ever want to get in touch with me directly, you can call or email me. You can also obviously leave comments down below, and if this was useful to you, please feel free to share it with your coworkers and other agencies. Like I said, this is an introduction. You can certainly talk with your clients, find out what their experiences are, ask them questions about this, ask them if there are ways that you can be more effective, or if there are things about homelessness that you just haven't picked up on yet that they can teach you about. As I said earlier, we have all the articles and books and everything that are referenced in this presentation. So if there was anything you saw that you want more information on, this will show you where to go for it. Some of these books and things I've quoted from many times in the presentation. Some of them I've only mentioned once or twice, and then there are a couple in here that I just used as background information, but I didn't actually quote from. But there's a lot of information out there.